In the Brown University and the MIT professor shootings, this man here was the person of interest who was later identified only as a homeless individual who was once a student at Brown University and just by the name of John. However, John gave some information to the police that was so important to this overall investigation and may have led to solving this case, or one of the many pieces of evidence that led to solving this case. And the mayor, Mayor Smiley, has sent a letter to the FBI imploring them to give the $50,000 reward. And whenever money is put up to have a witness come forward in a major investigation, the addendum usually is for the arrest, the apprehension, arrest, and conviction. So that's sort of a long hill to climb, because when John, this homeless fellow, was asked, and not just him, but members of the public, if you have any information, there's a $50,000 reward. And not only did John give information, but he actually confronted the perpetrator and chased him and saw the car that he was going into. Information that was invaluable at the time to the police. And that is something that we will discuss. And the other thing that we will discuss is we still do not know the motive. Maybe we will never know the motive in this case. Clearly, it looks like the perpetrator, Claudio Valente, had an axe to grind obviously with the MIT professor, Nuno Lovreiro, but also with Brown University. It isn't normal for someone, of course, to get a gun. And there's lots of evidence now that not only did he get a gun, but he reconned. He surveilled this location. He knew this location. So he gets a gun and shoots 9 students and kills 2 others. Shoots up a study hall. So many people have many, many questions. And we will try to clear up some of these questions, but I think these questions may still remain until the after-action report is done, and maybe even after that. Maybe we won't implicitly know why Claudio Valente, age 48, this man in this picture here, who was initially that person of interest, and here is his face shot here, and shots of him, a deeply disturbed man that could go onto a university campus with a firearm and just for no reason that we know of, shoot 11 students, 2 dead, 9 wounded. So folks, hold on to your hats, hold on to your loved ones, hold on to your thoughts, hold on to your service dog. We're about to enter true crime from a police perspective. We're about to enter the off-the-cuff zone, the police off-the-cuff zone. There has to be some common sense.
They were the ones who called 911 to get him help, and now they're calling for change.
Folks, we would like to remind you that this show is sponsored by FanDuel on the Believe Network. And yesterday, a lot of things changed for Super Bowl 60, but the odds are continually changing. But the Bills plus 500, the Chiefs plus 700, the Packers plus 750, the Lions plus 900, the Eagles plus 1,000, the Rams plus 1,600. It was going to be an exciting Super Bowl season. So, folks, when we talk about this case, there is a lot of people that feel that no justice has been arrived in this case, that we're not going to be able to get justice because justice would have included the perpetrator being arrested and prosecuted. But we know now that's never going to happen because the perpetrator, as has been reported wildly, took his own life. And there are many conspirators that think that perhaps that's not true. Perhaps he didn't take his own life. Perhaps this is a cover up. I mean, I don't believe that, but there are those that do. And so, for those that do, we want to try to answer those questions. But first, I wanted to just cover this that the Mayor Smiley, has actually written a letter to the FBI where he requests that they reward the $50,000 reward for the arrest, the apprehension, arrest, and conviction of the perpetrator in this case, Claudio Valente. Let's play a little bit of this from Fox.
Providence, Rhode Island, has written to FBI Director Kash Patel asking the $50,000 reward go to one witness who helped solve the case. Known as John, the witness was seen in surveillance photos released by Providence police earlier in the week as they worked to identify the gunman who opened fire on the campus, killing 2 students and wounding 9 others. Investigators say John followed and confronted the shooter, got a look at the information for the car that he was traveling in, then posted it on Reddit, which led police to the gunman identified as Claudio Neves Valente, that suspect accused in the Brown shooting, as well as the murder of an MIT professor outside of Boston, took his own life at a storage facility in New Hampshire. Rhode Island's Attorney General was very clear that John helped crack the case.
That person came forward to 2 Providence police officers over on the east side and said he had information, that he was that person and he had information that could help this case. And he blew this case right open.
All right, that was the Attorney General there in Rhode Island. Now, Providence Mayor Brett Smiley went one step further, writing a fairly lengthy letter to FBI Director Kash Patel, saying that John, a homeless former Brown University student, deserves that $50,000 reward. This right here on your screen, an excerpt of what he had to say. One individual amongst those who provided tips stands out above the rest, John. As discussed with the media, John is no less than a hero. His bravery, selflessness, and stewardship on behalf of his community went far beyond what anyone could ever hope from a tip. I believe that our community is breathing easier today because of the extraordinary assistance that John provided to our law enforcement agencies. I'm writing to you today to request that the entirety of that $50,000 reward be issued to this incredible Providence neighbor. I want to talk more about the reward and what we know and what we don't know about the case in general. Let's bring in Jeff Weninger, the founder and CEO of Law Enforcement Consultants, also a former Los Angeles police lieutenant.
You know, I find it a little suspicious that maybe suspicious isn't the right word. Unusual, perhaps, that a reward wasn't also put up by Brown University. Does anyone else find that to be suspicious or unusual? Because why would they have left it up to the FBI? A reward generates tips, generates phone calls. So I find that a bit curious that the university didn't put up any money.
Thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us today and help to kind of break all of this down in a case that has captured nationwide attention.
Well, thank you for having me, Josh.
Of course. And first off, I do want to ask you specifically about this reward situation. How does the whole situation kind of play out there? How is it determined whether or not someone gets the reward, but also who gets the reward?
Well, first and foremost, you have to concentrate on the language of the reward, which in this case, it states the identification, arrest, and conviction of the individual. Ultimately, the FBI has to nominate the individual, and then a committee will do an analysis. They'll look at the information that was received. What was the value of that information? How cooperative was the individual who provided that information? And what level of risk did they put themselves in when they came forward with that information?
No, it's a very high hill to climb here. After the fact, all of a sudden we have all of these necessary elements to being a witness. Unusual, right? But I guess there has to be some criteria to get and receive this award, or else so many people would lay claim to it. And whose information was most important? In this case, it seems like this homeless man, John, tell you the truth, I hope he gets this reward. Maybe it could change his life. But it seems like when they say, the apprehension, arrest, and conviction, well, that would seem to disqualify anyone from getting this reward, because the alleged perpetrator is no longer among us and took his own life and won't be prosecuted.
Ultimately, they will then make a recommendation for a certain amount, perhaps all, perhaps nothing, in regards to what will be the reward to that particular individual. And then ultimately, it is the Secretary of State that will sign off on it. But it is rather peculiar in this case because, generally speaking, the FBI won't even acknowledge or make it publicly known that a reward was even given, let alone the amount or the particular individual that it was given to.
And it's interesting to note because, as you said, the wording says conviction. However, as we know, the suspect took his own life, according to investigators there in New Hampshire. So I'm sure that will factor in as well. Now, how critical would you say, based on your law enforcement experience, that public assistance is in helping law enforcement to identify, locate a suspect in a case like this?
Well, in this case, it was very important because, for all intents and purposes, it looked as if the investigation had stalled. After they identified an individual they thought was the shooter, even to the extent where they released the name and photographs were being presented in the media with a name and a home state of Wisconsin and all those sorts of things, it seemed to have really stalled. And it's not unusual where law enforcement will appeal to the public to come forward with any information they may have, because oftentimes it's the smallest piece of information that can break it wide open. And in this case, it was identification of a gray Nissan with a license plate from Florida.
And of course, that Reddit post there from John, there's like a whole process there that appears to have played out according to investigators. Now, I did want to ask, because there are two separate crimes here. We're talking about those murders that happened a little more than a week ago there on the Brown University campus, but also the murder of that MIT professor on Monday, both linked here to the same gunman. And I wanted to ask, what maybe methods do investigators use to determine whether two incidents like this are connected? I'm sure.
Well, something, one of the things that we learned during this investigation was that perhaps he used a different gun on the MIT professor. And why do I think that? Because Nuno Lovreiro, initially, the FBI came back with saying that the cases are not related. And why would he have said that? I think that was also before they had the information about the vehicle. So perhaps it was a different gun, and it turned out that Claudio Valente had a bunch of guns. So he could have used a different gun to shoot the MIT professor than he used at the shooting at Brown University. So these are some of the questions I have, but as we know, initially, the FBI said the shootings were not related. And that was a little strange because many people, even in our true crime community, jumped at it saying, oh, I bet you the shooting of the MIT professor is related to the shooting of the Brown students. Just true crime followers said that early on in the investigation, and then the FBI agent in charge said, no, they're not related. And then he had to eat his words a couple days later. This is from News Nation.
What are investigators saying about the nature of these attacks, the motive as well?
Hey, Kelly, good evening. Yeah, lots of clues, right, indicating perhaps some sort of vendetta either against Brown University or that MIT professor or both, or perhaps against higher education. But right now, they're just those. They're clues right now at this point as investigators try to figure out what exactly was the motivation behind this rampage that really put an entire community on hold and held them hostage on trying to figure out when exactly this nightmare would come to an end. So that is what investigators are trying to solve. They're trying to get to the why right now. They also describe Valente as very strategic, saying he eluded detection by switching between multiple license plates, using specialized phones and SIM cards, European SIM cards, all this to avoid and block tracking. An autopsy yesterday revealed that Valente took his own life on Tuesday, the same day as he killed the MIT professor, investigators believe. And then the critical break in the case came from a Reddit tipster known as John. He spotted Valente acting suspiciously, reported his rental car with Florida plates, and that detail, authorities say, blew the entire case wide open. I've been here every day since last week. Those press conferences were getting more and more tense as a suspect was not being identified. The mayor, Brett Smiley, often leading those press conferences, spoke last night with our Elizabeth Vargas about that intense pressure on him and police.
There was extraordinary pressure on our police department, our partners. I felt that pressure personally. Maybe around day 3 of the investigation, my community started to get, pretty anxious, and it felt like it was dragging. And then the case broke open, and so when we got that witness to come forward was a moment of great progress. That was a relief.
We discussed in this investigation that many of the politicians, and I always say politicians never met a camera they didn't like. They need to get off the press conferences. Stop. I mean, there is a place for politicians in press conferences, but there no way should they be dominating the press conferences. The domination of the press conferences should be coming from law enforcement, reporting the investigative steps, asking the community for help, telling the community certain facts that will bring forth tips. But politicians get up there and they just suck all the air out of the room. And this guy's one of them,
A huge sigh of relief for everybody in this community. Valente was a former graduate student at Brown, but left after really only a semester. Officials say it's highly likely he targeted the Barris and Holly building that he shot up, as he had taken many classes there, so perhaps was familiar with it. The investigation also revealed a deep personal connection to MIT professor Lovreiro. For 5 years, the two studied at the same academic program in Portugal, both graduating at the top of their class. Now, the big question here is trying to figure out what sort of direct connection, communication those two might have had, and then also just any sort of grievances that he might have had with Brown University. But again, all this stretches back decades now, and that's really the big question. That's a really hard puzzle to solve when you're stretching over such a long time period, right, Kelly?
All right, leads to even more questions. So, Marcus, what more are you learning now about Valente's life in the U.S. Before these attacks?
Yeah, he was a bit of a ghost. I mean, he came here in 2000 for that program, and then according to family, kind of dropped off the map, didn't really communicate or talk with them much, and then reemerged in 2017 as a naturalized citizen. And then from there, really no movement. Investigators don't even know what sort of job he held in between that time as of now. And so those are the strange questions that investigators are dealing with right now, is that gap in knowing what he was doing for so long in America. And it remains unclear, again, where he worked or what he was doing. He had no known U.S. criminal record. Investigators say he had been moving through New England since November. That's when it was also said that he booked a hotel in Boston in November, and then got that rental car December 1st. And as I've said all week, and investigators have said, and people you've had on today, talking about, it's clear that he had preparations for this, casing out this area the day of and also weeks beforehand. So you have clear intent. I think investigators are fairly confident saying you just don't have that motivation or that why. And that can be really frustrating, especially for the families of these victims, because while that's never going to bring them back, at least it can try to provide some sort of insight here. And I think that closure may never come for them because, of course, he is now dead from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. And investigators are trying to piece together now, without his help, why he did this.
So still many, many questions, not that many answers. But as I say all the time on this show, investigation takes time. And they may find out answers to some of the questions that we have, and they may not. For those that don't believe he committed suicide, I'm just going to mention a couple of things. First of all, in a suicide, the gun should be there. And potentially the gun could be still in his hand. That all depends. Also, most people that commit suicide and shoot themselves in the head, they put the gun up against their head. They don't do this, they do that, or a couple of inches away. So forensically, what that does is, if you do it this close, you're going to have what's called a close contact wound and something called tattooing, where the barrel of the gun actually leaves an imprint, especially if you press it up against your head or your skin. So that'll leave something called tattooing and stippling. These are all forensic terms or ballistics terms. And that will show that the person committed suicide. In addition to the fact that they can do other tests on the gun, DNA, fingerprints. But that is how some of the evidence for the people that believe he did not kill himself, that is one of the ways, or many of the ways, that they can determine forensically. Because I know there's a lot of people saying they don't believe that he killed himself, right? So the criminal case of Claudio Valente obviously is closed. He'll never face a prosecutor or a judge. And for the families of Ella Cook, Mohammed Aziz Umarzakov, and Professor Nuno Lovreiro, there is no justice, only the immeasurable loss of their loved ones. For the Brown University community and the 7 wounded survivors, the scars, both physical and emotional, will remain. What we're left with is a chilling portrait of a man who may have held onto his anger for more than 2 decades. A man whose academic promise possibly curdled into a resentment so profound that it drove him to murder innocent students and a former peer in the case of the MIT professor. The story of Claudio Valente is a terrifying reminder that the deepest motives for violence can be buried for years, hidden from view, just waiting for a trigger. His actions leave us with a final haunting question. How many other ghosts of the past walk among us until their silent rage erupts? Those are some of the questions we have in all of these types of investigations. And we may never, ever know the answers to this, but we do know more than we knew, of course, when this first occurred. And think of all the man hours, all the people that were involved in this investigation. There was a lot of criticism about this investigation, about how it was botched. And then, of course, how early on they had the wrong person. But then they reversed course. And I believe overall, look, they solved the case. Even though no one's going to be prosecuted, they have the right guy. And for that, we have to be thankful. This is Fox with former FBI agent
students, as well as the murder of an MIT professor. But a former classmate of the alleged shooter identified some red flags, telling Fox News Digital, quote, "During his time at Brown, I was essentially his only friend. He was socially awkward, and so was I. which I think is why we connected. He could be kind and gentle, though he often became frustrated, sometimes angry about courses, professors, and living conditions. Joining me now is retired FBI Supervisory Special Agent James Gagliano. And James, as law enforcement tries to piece together a motive and the history of this killer, can they ultimately use that profile of the killer to prevent the next tragedy before it happens? Or is this really all in an effort to figure out the profile of a killer after a killing?
Well, sure, Todd, you're always looking to figure out some way to get out in front of the next one. We want lessons learned. We don't always follow them. That's the problem. We find out sometimes we repeat the same mistakes. What we find out about these killers in the behavioral sciences unit at the FBI are usually the ones that build out these profiles. They're typically enigmas. They're often disenfranchised, disaffected. In this instance, you have a 46-year-old foreign national, and the pieces just don't seem to be coming together. You have two separate shootings. You know, a week ago Saturday at 4 o'clock, the Brown attack happens where 2 students are killed, a number are still in critical condition. Then 2 days later, just a little over 48 hours later, the MIT professor is shot inside his home. The first one appeared to be more random. Maybe he selected the location. There was something there. And we call the assassination culture this, Todd. It's made up of 3 things. A grievance. These are all grievance collectors. You apply an ideology to that, and then you add the patina of moral absolutism. Well, that one is kind of unsure because it doesn't seem like anybody was targeted. You fast forward to the MIT professor being basically executed in his home, and that seemed to be targeted. Now, Todd, I'll close with this. Interestingly enough, there were 2 9mm semi-automatic pistols that were used for these homicides, one in one case and one in the other. Did he think that maybe he wasn't going to get caught? Difficult to tell, but I think we'll know some more.
So there's a good lesson too, and also for law enforcement. Because the ballistics from one case to another case doesn't match, that does not 100% mean it's not the same shooter. Because the shooter, if he uses the same MO, could have a different gun, which he did in this case. So to just jump at this and say, oh, as the FBI supervisory agent in charge did say, he said the MIT shooter and the Brown University shooter are 2 different people. From the chat at KMTX78, member for 35 months, love being part of this community. Well, we love having you here. Thank you so much. All you folks out there, this is Police Off the Cuff, Real Crime Stories. If you're not subscribed, hit that subscribe button, give us a thumbs up. Like us, share us, make lots of comments. If you want to contribute financially, we have a Patreon with 4 different levels, and we also have a YouTube channel membership with 5 different levels, and you can contribute to this channel, which is basically 4,000 from hitting the 100,000 mark, which we've been working very hard to reach. I thought that we would reach it this year, and a little bit disappointed, but lots of things happened in the last year, including getting hacked. That slowed us down a little bit, and I'm just grateful and happy that I still have the support of all you guys, because I almost lost this channel, very close to losing it, because of really no fault of my, well, it was my fault. I stupidly clicked on something that caused a chain reaction of negative results, but we're back on, and I'm so thrilled to be back on. And I'm so thrilled to see so many of you subscribers have come back. Let's go back to James Gagliano in regards to this case.
Facts, I think, coming up pretty soon. The investigation is only a week old.
Let's be clear. It's tough to sort of create a profile and prevent the next one of these. I think that is difficult. Certainly the FBI, BAU, Behavioral Analysis Unit, they try to do that. But you know what's not hard? Fortifying your buildings, fortifying your schools. And it turns out that Brown did not do that. A former Brown University student now speaking out on what the university spends money on. And let's face it, it's not security. Listen.
it is sort of confusing to people is that you have a school that costs $100,000 a year. You have an $8 billion endowment. How come the building doesn't have cameras? I don't think it's particularly surprising that the old buildings on campus have never been retrofitted with updated security systems because that's not what their priorities are with the spending, and that they know that people will want to come to Brown anyway.
As a parent, this is unconscionable to me. So, James, will this be a wake-up calls to these lax colleges and universities, or is this one of those things we're going to go back to business as usual once the memory of this Brown tragedy fades?
Todd, I'll disagree with you here. I don't think it was a mistake. I think it's purposeful. I think that there's a certain ideology that thinks, hey, we don't want to become part of, quote unquote, the surveillance state. Look what you had at Brown, a postage stamp of a university. It's a quarter square mile by a quarter square mile. I think it's 146 acres, 246 buildings there. There were 1,200 cameras available on campus. Back in 2021, a doctoral student at Brown had actually written a letter to the campus newspaper and complained about the proliferation of cameras. Did that have something to do with this? Well, when I listened to the press conference and heard it, just the president of the university basically get out there and act indifferent, with a certain level of insouciance to suggest, well, it wouldn't have stopped it if there had been cameras there. No, but it might have helped to stop the next one. The MIT professor was killed 2 days later. If there had been any video on campus that had drawn a link to this person sooner, maybe that murder could have been prohibited or not happen.
Absolutely terrifying. Your words there.
He's 100% right. And these cameras, and today they're much more sophisticated. They're called smart cameras. And someone doesn't even have to be watching the cameras for the camera to report a security breach to the mainframe of the computer. And if they see something like a man, unknown, unrecognized man walking in and out of these buildings who hasn't been confronted, who hasn't been identified, who didn't have the clearance to enter the building, the cameras can actually report that to the computer system, even if someone's not watching. And that a lot of major cities have these smart cameras. For example, when someone leaves a backpack somewhere that could have a pressure cooker bomb inside it, the camera will report back to the computer. Not that there's a pressure cooker bomb in it, but there was a backpack left on 42nd Street and 8th Avenue on the northeast corner. And what's going to happen? Well, the police are going to respond, and they're going to check that out. Same thing like with a building like Brown. And a lot of these Ivy League schools, of course, they have highly political protests. In some cases, they even endorse these protesters. So perhaps that's why they're very laissez-faire about these cameras. And many people will say, oh, it's against our civil liberties, our civil, we shouldn't be watched 24/7. What about our liberty? How come we're being watched everywhere we go? Well, it's called safety, And if you're not doing anything wrong, why should you really care about your image being recorded? Isn't it making everyone safer? And when I watched the Brown University president, Dr. Paxson, who's been there since 2012, and I did a little research into how much she gets paid. She gets paid $3.1 million a year. Why does a college president deserve that level of pay? And where is that pay coming from? Well, indirectly, it's coming from you and me, taxpayers, because part of the endowments of these Ivy League institutions and many other institutions come from taxpayers. So why is the president of Brown, and I can't even imagine what the president of Columbia, or the president of Harvard, the president of Princeton, the president of all these Ivy League schools, how much money do they make? These are questions that I have. So shouldn't the security people, the professionals, have something to say about the security on the campus? Not the college president, who may have her own agenda to keep that $3.1 million in salary flowing? I think so.
That this could have been purposeful in the sense of, hey, we're not going to be a surveillance state. But you know what happens when you don't have cameras and you don't have fortifications? People die. James Gagliano, thank you for your time. Appreciate it.
So there you go. A lot of questions here. A lot of questions. Folks, we are sponsored by FanDuel, Police Off the Cuff on the Believe Network. So the big question, of course, and we may never, ever know this, but is, of course, motive. Will we ever know the motive on this case? And many things besides the cameras, people questioned the professionalism of the law enforcement people who ran this investigation, who responded to this location. And I say all the time that investigation is an equal part art and an equal part science. And police work is redundant, but it's important that it's redundant so that you take the investigative steps that are necessary to solve a crime like this. This is part of what many people complained about in the press conference coming from Brown University and the Providence police commissioner pretty much every day after the shooting.
That subject matched the description of that person of interest that this police department was desperate to put handcuffs on. That individual was identified as Claudio Valente.
As you heard there, the suspect, 48-year-old Claudio Valente. Law enforcement announced they found him dead in a storage unit in New Hampshire with a self-inflicted gunshot wound. He was a former Brown student, but 20 plus years ago, a Portuguese national who was granted permanent U.S. residency back in 2017, last address in Miami, Florida. In an affidavit, investigators said a campus custodian and a Reddit post helped narrow the search for the suspect. The gunman, of course, opened fire on Saturday, killing 2 students and wounding 9 others on the Ivy League campus. Valente is also suspected of killing the MIT professor in Brookline, Massachusetts, days later. Officials said it appeared the men attended the same university in Portugal. A sad ending to a horrible story. Let's talk about it. With us, criminal defense attorneys Joe Tamburino and David Bruno, and former FBI Special Agent Jennifer Coffendeffer. Davis Valentino was also responsible, of course, for killing that professor. The facts are all coming in overnight. I want to go through quickly the timeline here and some of the facts that we know. He was born in Portugal, but a permanent resident. He arrived in the U.S. in 2000 as an F1 student at Brown. He attended school only from the fall of 2000 to the spring of 2001 in the PhD program for physics, went on a leave of absence after spring, and then he withdrew officially in 2003. He's got no criminal record. December 1st, he goes to Boston, rents a Nissan Sentra, drives to Brown, basically that vicinity. Then on the 13th, he opens fire in the physics building at Brown during a study session, killing those 2 students. December 15th is when he is accused of arriving at the MIT physics professor's house outside of Boston, shooting him in Brookline. Then he switches the license plate on that rental car, goes out to this storage facility they had rented in New Hampshire, and that's where his body is found yesterday. And bringing this manhunt to an end.
So a lot of moving parts there, but doesn't explain motive. And, when you hear people say that we need to study him and, and study his modus operandi and study the why and the how he did this. I don't think he's doing anything so unusual that we could study him. And how does he differ than any other active shooter. And having said that, I still believe you have to do a post-investigation to find out things that you may not know now, and also to critique yourself, to critique the investigation. How what we did, how did it contribute to capturing the perpetrator here? How did it slow down the capture of the perpetrator? How could we learn from this so we do it better the next time? And those are some of the questions we all have. And because next week or the week after or a month from now, this is going to happen somewhere else. That just happens to be the reality. It's going to happen somewhere else, excuse me. Patrick Sanford, FBI. Heather, the worst part is all schools do crap to suggest they are safer than they are. In 2016, my college and a number of others were outed for dissuading SA victims from going to cops, so numbers look low. You know, Patrick Sanford, FBI, that is the nature of colleges. And the only thing that has made colleges report their crime a little more than they used to is something called the Cleary Campus Safety Act that was based on a New York State University student, a SUNY student, back in I think it was the early 80s, that was raped and murdered on a campus in the SUNY system. And the school knew there was a serial rapist roaming the area where the college was and didn't warn students. So now colleges, through the Cleary, spelled CLERY, Campus Security Safety Act, are required and also keep and post their crime statistics on the website of the college. But Patrick Sanford, FBI, you are 1,000% correct. Colleges do try to hide crime because, look, we could look at the Idaho 4 murders, just off the campus of the University of Idaho, in which Brian Koberger pled guilty and was sentenced to 4 life terms. They couldn't wait to get that case done with. And they did something before the case even went to trial, and it turned out it didn't go to trial because the perpetrator pled guilty. But they petitioned to have the house knocked down. And that house where the murders were committed was the biggest piece of evidence in that case. And we spoke about it on our podcast, Police Off the Cuff, Real Crime Stories, and said how ridiculous it was that they knocked the house down. They still did it because the college community in Idaho, they have a lot of power. And they wanted the memory of those 4 murders erased from the consciousness of the public. But you are 100% right. Colleges are not forthcoming. I have seen that in my own investigative work with certain colleges in New York City. And they're not always all that cooperative when things occur. It becomes very political. They start calling politicians and they start dealing with the chiefs on the NYPD instead of dealing with the investigators who are investigating the case. So, Patrick Sanford, FBI, 100%, you're preaching to the choir, and thank you for your comments. This is from News Nation.
Institutions rocked by horrific acts of gun violence. The first at Brown University, when a gunman walked into a classroom during finals and opened fire, killing 2 students and hurting 9 more. Then 2 days later, 50 miles away, another shooting that claimed the life of an MIT professor. After a days-long manhunt, authorities found the suspect they believe was behind both of those attacks, 48-year-old former Brown grad student Claudio Neves Valente. He was found late Thursday night dead by a self-inflicted gunshot wound. We do want to bring in Providence City Councilman and Brown alum John Gonsalves on this. John, thank you so much for making the time, and I'm sorry for what your community has been through recently.
Thank you, Natasha. Our hearts are heavy.
Yeah.
2 young lives were taken and families were changed forever. And that fear and exhaustion in our community over the last 6 days have placed an extraordinary emotional and psychological strain on our community. And I'm grateful that I'm here
It's hard to believe that it's only been about a week since this happened. Police are still trying to figure out a motive for this. We have learned that the suspect is a former Brown student himself. Apparently, he was a promising young doctoral student in the physics department before he dropped out. We learned that this shooting happened in a building that he used to study in. Does there need to be more security going forward on campus? I mean, could anything have prevented this?
I think the Brown University folks are looking into every single detail here. There's an extraordinary amount of grief in the community.
I think you can't trust the Brown University people to decide this. What you need is a private security group that does a complete survey without the input from the security department or the college president, goes in there and does their professional job and says, this is what's wrong and this is what you need to change. These are our recommendations. And then if Brown doesn't do this, and this document can become public because it's published, this is the recommendations, Acme Security Company used after the Brown shooting. This is the recommendations they made. How many of these recommendations did Brown entertain? How many did they use? How many did they change? Is the school safer now that you complied, that you bought new smart cameras, that you retrofitted the entire campus with them? What have you changed? What protocols have you changed with your security guards? Because let's face it, someone propped open the door of this study hall, which enabled the shooter just to walk in. Supposedly the shooter had been walking around those buildings days and weeks before. How was that allowed? How was he not challenged? What changes are you going to make to that? We always hear terms like, it was a soft target. We need to harden the target. What does that mean? To know what that means, you also have to understand what security is. Security is, right, to protect assets and reduce risks. What are the number one asset anywhere in this world? Human beings is the answer. The number one asset are humans, right? So how do we reduce risks? Well, we reduce risks by having video cameras that can watch people. We reduce risk by locking certain doors. We reduce risk by having visible security personnel. We reduce risks by having the students, become part of the security program, by entertaining them and educating them in regards to what is expected of them. No, you're not expected to prop open doors because that puts everyone at risk. Let's go back.
Cease. Accountability and beginning the long work of healing is the priority. In Rhode Island, our state motto is hope. And right now, hope means caring for one another and staying grounded in the changes that need to occur. But ultimately, Ella Cook and Mohammed Aziz Morzakov, they should still be here. And our hearts go out to their families as they grieve.
The mayor of Providence, we know, saying that both the city and the university would benefit from security reviews after this attack. And he says this includes an audit into surveillance assets that might be lacking in the building where this happened. We know Brown has around 1,200 cameras, but that building itself, even though it was pretty freshly renovated, had few, if any. Do you think that reviewing the surveillance in the building and around campus is enough to prevent an attack like this from happening again?
I think so, and I agree with the mayor and his sentiments. An audit certainly needs to happen. Accountability still needs to occur here.
You know what is one of the most powerful things in having a school change the way they do things? It's called lawsuits. It's called getting sued. It's called parting with millions of dollars, and they're going to part with millions of dollars in these lawsuits. So they have no choice but to comply with this security company that is no doubt they're going to hire to do an audit, to check out this school and see what went right and see what went wrong. And they will comply. Trust me, because when you get sued for millions and millions of dollars, especially the families of the two students that were murdered as well as the students that were shot, the school is going to have to own up to what they did wrong and correct it so that this $3.1 million college president isn't the one solely making the decisions on security, because that can be political. How you secure buildings at an Ivy League school can become deeply political, right? And you might not know this, but if you work out in the public sector, especially those in law enforcement, you know how politics meets head on with security and with law enforcement. You know, I've talked to people before that do podcasts, and they'll say, "Oh, I don't want to get political." And you know what I say? You know something, dude? The P in police, you know what it stands for? Politics. Because there's no organization on this earth more affected by politics than police work, than police departments. And everything the police do is mandated by law and mandated by politicians who may or may not know anything about law enforcement. So when you see these active shooting cases, you see crimes on college campuses, just remember that the college is motivated a lot by having students keep coming to their school. And when bad events like this happen, what happens? Well, do you think the University of Idaho had a drop in students after the quadruple murder in November 2022? I think that's probably obvious. You think when schools have murders on their campus or rapes on their campus, do you think that affects their bottom line as far as students registering to become students or students wanting to go to a certain college? You bet. So let's hope the transparency that is necessary to make college campuses safe will be at the forefront of the Brown University community, because we don't ever want to see something like this happen again. Folks, I'm Bill Cannon from Police Off the Cuff Real Crime Stories. Thank you so much for tuning in. As new information comes in on this case, and if anything relative to his motive comes in, the shooter's motive, we will report it to you. Have a wonderful holiday season. Feliz Navidad, Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah, Happy Kwanzaa. Spend some time with your family and friends, and stay healthy, friends. Have a great day, and God bless.
One episode, just ain't enough.